He humiliated her without blinking. His entire board watched him do it. He had no idea she once pulled him out of a burning car and disappeared before he ever saw her face. This is the story of Renata Cole, a woman who spent 3 years trying to keep a promise to a dying man, and Julian Marsh, a billionaire who spent 15 years running from a night he could barely remember. Neither of them knew, on the morning this story begins, that their lives had already been tangled together for 2 decades. Neither of them knew that a single notebook, dismissed in front of a room full of strangers, was about to unravel a truth buried since before either of them understood what they had lost. By the time this is over, you will understand why a man who built an empire out of control once owed his very heartbeat to a stranger he never thanked, and why she never said a word to defend herself. Before I take you into that boardroom, do one thing for me. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. I go through every single one, and I respond personally. Then take a second to subscribe, because there's a moment coming in this story that will change everything you think you understand about who deserves to be seen. If you can already feel there's more to this than one bad meeting, stay with me, because Renata's story doesn't start in that boardroom. It starts 3 years earlier, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, with a man who was running out of time and a woman who had no idea how much weight one promise could carry. Michael Cole had spent 19 years as an engineer for a mid-sized firm that built safety systems for commercial and personal vehicles under contract to larger fleet operators, the kind of unglamorous work nobody thanks you for until something goes wrong. 16 years before Renata ever set foot in a boardroom, he identified a flaw in a valve assembly his firm supplied to several regional service providers, one of them a small logistics company that would, within a decade, grow into Julian Marsh's empire. He brought his warning to his supervisors. They told him it wasn't in the budget. A year later, a vehicle serviced under that same contract hydroplaned off a flooded overpass. Michael read about the crash in the local paper and recognized the make and service history well enough to suspect what he could never prove alone. He raised the warning a second time. He was told, again, that it wasn't in the budget. He kept his original drawings and spent his final years, after his diagnosis, refining them into the notebook Renata would eventually carry into that boardroom, certain that someday, somebody would have to listen. What Michael never told Renata, not until the very end, was why he couldn't let it go. He believed, though he was never able to prove it, that a crash he'd read about in the local paper years earlier had happened because of the exact flaw he'd tried to warn his supervisors about. A husband and wife, on a rain-soaked overpass, a truck that shouldn't have been on the road that night. He didn't know the names. He didn't know that one of the people in that crash would, years later, be sitting across a boardroom table from his wife, refusing to look at the very design that might have saved his family, or that the woman he was dismissing had already saved his life once, in a way neither of them would understand until it was almost too late. Michael wasn't entirely alone in what he knew. Terrence Boyd, who'd worked beside him for over a decade, had backed him up both times he raised the warning and watched both times as it went nowhere. When Michael got sick, Terrence was one of the few people who came to see him every week, and he was the one who helped Renata understand, in plain terms, what the notebook actually meant and why her husband had refused to let it go. He never went further than sitting with her privately. He didn't have Michael's original employer's records anymore, and he had a family and a mortgage he couldn't risk. But when Yolanda Briggs later went looking for anyone who could confirm Michael Cole's history, Terrence was the first person who picked up the phone and told her everything. Renata met Michael when she was 26, waiting tables at a diner 2 blocks from his office, and she used to tease him that he loved his blueprints more than he loved her, though she never once meant it. They built a small consulting business together in their 30s, hers handling the books and the clients, his handling the work nobody else wanted to touch, the unglamorous inspections and retrofits that kept small trucking companies compliant and safe. It wasn't glamorous money, but it was theirs, built from nothing, the kind of thing you protect with your whole chest. When the diagnosis came, stage 4, moving faster than anyone expected, Michael didn't ask her to save the business. He asked her to save the notebook. She still remembers exactly what he said, because she has replayed it more times than she can count. He told her the design wasn't about money, and it was never about being right. He told her that somewhere out there, someone was still driving with the same flaw he'd tried to warn people about. and that if she could just get it in front of the right person, one time, it might matter. She promised him she would. She had no idea what the right person would eventually mean, no idea that fulfilling that promise would put her in a room with the one man in the country least willing to hear it, and no idea that he was the reason she'd made a choice 15 years earlier that she had never told a single living soul about. Julian Marsh was 31 years old the night everything changed, already 3 years into building what would eventually become one of the largest logistics and freight companies on the East Coast. He was the kind of man people described as relentless before they described him as kind. The sort of executive who read every contract twice and trusted almost no one to make a decision without him in the room. His wife, Deborah, used to joke that he negotiated with the waiter over dinner reservations the same way he negotiated with vendors, and she loved him anyway, loved the intensity that made him impossible to work for and impossible not to love at the same time. They had one son, 5 years old, who thought his father hung the moon simply because his father was rarely home enough to disappoint him. The night of the crash, Julian was driving them home from his mother's house along a stretch of overpass that had flooded twice that same year, a stretch the city had been warned about and never repaired. The car caught fire on impact, the fuel line severed against the guardrail, flames working up from the undercarriage before Julian had even fully registered that the world had stopped moving. What Julian remembers, on the nights he lets himself remember anything at all, comes in fragments. Headlights where there shouldn't have been headlights. The sound of metal doing something metal isn't supposed to do. Deborah's hand reaching for his in the half-second before the world turned over. He does not remember the woman who pulled him from the wreckage. He has spent 15 years being told, by doctors and by his own mother, that a stranger got him out before the car went up, and that the same stranger was gone before anyone could get her name, her face, or even a description worth repeating. For years, Julian told himself he didn't need to know who she was. He built an entire identity around not needing anything from anyone, and the unnamed woman who saved his life became, in his mind, one more thing he had survived rather than one more debt he owed. Once, about 6 years after the crash, in a low moment he never told anyone about, Julian hired a private investigator to try to find her. His mother remembered the hospital staff mentioning a woman, mid-30s maybe, gone before anyone thought to ask her name. The investigator worked the case for 3 weeks, turned up nothing solid, and Julian called it off, telling himself it didn't matter anymore, telling himself a debt you can't repay is easier to forget than to keep chasing. He never mentioned it to anyone again. He didn't know, sitting in his office 9 years later reading Yolanda's file, that the woman he'd stopped looking for had been 15 minutes from him the entire time, in a boardroom, on a Tuesday, watching him laugh at the one thing she'd carried out of her husband's life work. He funneled grief into growth, turning a single freight company into an empire spanning 3 states, hiring the sharpest people he could find and firing them just as fast if they slowed him down. Somewhere in the building of all that, he stopped being a man people liked and became a man people feared, which he told himself was the same thing as respect. Nobody in his boardroom, on the morning Renata Cole walked in holding her late husband's notebook, knew they were about to watch their CEO humiliate the one person on earth who already knew exactly what he sounded like in the worst moment of his life, because she had heard him screaming Deborah's name while she dragged him through broken glass. Renata had rehearsed the meeting in her head for weeks, standing in front of her bathroom mirror the night before, practicing the exact words she would use to explain what the notebook meant without sounding desperate. She had requested the meeting through 3 separate assistants before anyone agreed to give her 15 minutes, and even then, she suspected the only reason she got the room was that someone on Julian's legal team wanted a paper trail showing they had heard her out before rejecting her formally. She walked into that boardroom in the one blazer she owned that still fit the way it used to, carrying Michael's notebook in both hands like something that might break, and for the first 90 seconds, she believed she was being taken seriously. Julian didn't even look up from his phone when she started speaking. She explained who Michael was. She explained the design, the 2 rejections he'd received from his own employer years earlier, the retrofit costs, the lives it could plausibly have saved if anyone had listened the first time. She placed the notebook on the table and slid it toward the center, toward him, and asked only that someone qualified review the actual engineering before dismissing it. Julian picked it up without opening it. He held it for exactly as long as it takes to make a point, then set it back down, farther from himself than it had started, and told her, in front of every director on his board, that his company did not build strategy around notebooks bought at a discount store, and that if her late husband's work had been worth anything, someone would have paid for it while he was still alive to sell it. The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough people, the kind of laughter that spreads because nobody wants to be the one person not laughing when the boss makes a joke. Grant Osei did not laugh. He'd been Julian's chief of staff for 9 years, long enough to remember a version of Julian who used to ask more questions before he made decisions, and long enough to feel the distance between that man and the one who'd just humiliated a stranger over a notebook nobody had actually read. Grant said nothing in the room, because saying something in that room had never once changed Julian's mind. But he watched Renata's face on her way out, and he did something he rarely did anymore. He kept thinking about it after everyone else had moved on. Julian moved on to the next item on the agenda within 30 seconds, already forgetting her name, already certain he had wasted 15 minutes on nothing, with no idea that he had just insulted the one person alive who had felt his pulse stop and started it again with her own hands on a flooded overpass 15 years earlier. The 2 weeks after that boardroom cost Renata more than the meeting itself ever had. Word travels fast in small business circles, and within days, 2 clients who'd been on the fence about signing with her quietly went elsewhere, one of them telling her outright that he'd heard she'd made a fool of herself in front of Julian Marsh's entire company. She fell behind on her office lease for the first time in 3 years, and sat one night doing the math on how many more months she could keep the doors open before she'd have to close them for good. Terrence came by that week, the way he always did, and found her sitting with Michael's notebook closed on the table in front of her, untouched since she'd carried it home. She told him, quietly, that maybe she'd done enough, that maybe some promises were never meant to be kept all the way through, that maybe Michael would understand if she finally let it go. Terrence didn't argue with her. He just reminded her that Michael never once asked her to win. He'd only asked her to try, one more time than anyone thought was reasonable. She didn't reopen the notebook that night, but she didn't throw it away either. If you're still with me, drop a comment telling me who you think is more wrong in this story so far. I go through everyone. Yolanda Briggs had been with Julian's company for 6 years, running quality audits on the freight and vehicle divisions, the kind of methodical, unglamorous work that rarely got her name mentioned in any meeting she wasn't personally sitting in. 2 weeks after Renata walked out of that boardroom, Yolanda was pulled into an unrelated task, digging through 2 decades of archived incident reports as part of a routine insurance review, the kind of assignment nobody wants and everybody eventually gets. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She was cross-referencing old vehicle maintenance flags against a list of discontinued parts when a scan memo stopped her mid-scroll, dated 16 years earlier, describing a brake failure risk in a specific valve assembly. The engineer's name at the bottom was Michael Cole. Yolanda sat with that name for a long moment before she remembered where she'd heard it, then pulled the file properly this time, and found a second memo, filed a year later, the same warning raised again, this time referencing a crash that had already happened. Buried 3 folders deeper was the accident report itself, a vehicle on a flooded overpass, the same valve assembly flagged as a possible contributing factor. The investigation quietly closed. The names attached to that crash were Julian and Deborah Marsh. She read it twice to be sure she wasn't imagining the connection, then a third time, because some truths feel too large to trust on the first read. The design Renata had brought into that boardroom wasn't a stranger's fantasy. It was the exact fix for the exact flaw that had, in all likelihood, caused the crash that killed Julian's wife and son. Michael Cole had tried to warn his employer about this failure a full year before that overpass. Yolanda closed her laptop, sat in the quiet of her office for several minutes, and understood that she was now holding something that could either be buried a second time or handed to the one man who needed to see it more than anyone alive. She chose to walk it straight to Grant Osei's office instead of Julian's, because she suspected, correctly, that Grant was the only person in that building who wouldn't dismiss her on sight. Julian was in his office finishing a call when Grant knocked, and something in Grant's face told him to end it early. Grant didn't say much at first. He just placed the folder on the desk, opened to the page Yolanda had flagged, and let Julian read it himself rather than trying to explain it out loud. Julian scanned the memo once quickly, the way he read everything, and then went still in a way Grant had never seen him go still before. He read Michael Cole's name a second time. He read the date. He turned the page to the accident report, to the flooded overpass, to the valve assembly listed as a possible contributing factor, and for the first time in 15 years, the fragments he'd never let himself examine too closely started arranging themselves into something he couldn't look away from. He asked Grant one question, quietly, almost like he already knew the answer and didn't want to hear it confirmed. He asked whether this was the same notebook the woman had brought into the boardroom 2 weeks earlier. Grant told him it was. Julian sat with that for a long moment, staring at nothing, running back through every detail of that meeting. The blazer, the way she'd set the notebook down so carefully, the way she'd picked it back up without arguing, without raising her voice, without giving him a single reason to remember her name. He had told a room full of people that her husband's life work wasn't worth the discount paper it was written on. He had said it laughing. Julian asked for everything Yolanda had found, every document, every date, cross-referenced twice before he believed it. He learned that Michael Cole had warned his own employer about the exact flaw a full year before the crash. He learned the warning had been filed and forgotten. The way inconvenient truths often are when the cost of fixing them is higher than the cost of ignoring them. And somewhere in that reading, an older memory surfaced, one he buried under 15 years of refusing to examine it, a pair of hands pulling him through broken glass, a voice telling him to stay awake, to keep his eyes open, a voice he had never been able to place because he'd never let himself go looking for it. He asked Grant to find out everything he could about the woman from the boardroom. Not her business. Not her claim. Her. Julian's legal team found out before Renata did. Within a day of Grant briefing them on what Yolanda had uncovered, 2 of Julian's senior counsel sat across from him with a very different recommendation than the one he expected. Adopting Michael Cole's design company-wide, they told him, especially now, would all but confirm that the company's own predecessor negligence had contributed to the crash that killed his wife and son, opening the door to liability the company had spent 15 years never having to answer for. One of them suggested, carefully, that the fix could still be implemented quietly, folded into a routine equipment upgrade. No bulletin, no names, no acknowledgement of where it came from. Grant was the only person in the room who pushed back, reminding Julian that quiet was exactly what had killed Deborah and his son in the first place. Exactly what had cost Michael Cole a fair hearing while he was alive to give one. Julian sat with both arguments for 3 days before he made his decision. He told his legal team he understood the risk, and he was doing it anyway, in full, with Michael Cole's name attached to every part of it, because he had spent 15 years letting silence protect him, and it had never once made him feel like less of a coward for it. Renata was locking up her office when Julian's car pulled up outside. No security detail, no assistant trailing behind him, just a man standing on the sidewalk like he wasn't sure he had the right to be there. She recognized him immediately, of course. You don't forget the face of the man you watched laugh at you in front of his entire board, even if weeks have passed. What she didn't expect was the way he looked now. None of the polish from the boardroom, none of the certainty, just a man holding her husband's notebook against his chest like it might disappear if he loosened his grip. He didn't apologize first. He asked her a question instead, quietly, almost afraid of the answer. He asked if she had ever, 15 years ago, pulled someone from a burning car on a flooded overpass and left before anyone could get her name. Renata went still. She had never told anyone that story, not even the people closest to her, because she had never wanted the attention, had never once connected the stranger she'd saved that night to anything beyond the 20 minutes she'd spent kneeling in broken glass, telling a man to keep his eyes open until help came. She asked him how he possibly could have found that out. He held up the notebook and told her everything Yolanda had found. The memo, the accident report, Michael's name at the bottom of a warning nobody had listened to a full year before his own family drove onto that overpass. Renata sat down on the curb outside her own office, because her legs would not have held her standing. Julian sat down beside her, close enough to hear, but not close enough to touch, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all. He told her he had spent 15 years wondering who the woman was who saved him, and weeks humiliating the same woman without ever once looking closely enough to see her. He told her Michael had tried to save his family before either of them ever needed saving from anything, and that the world had ignored him for it. Renata, through tears she didn't bother hiding, told him the only thing she had ever wanted was for someone to finally listen, not to her, but to Michael, because she had spent 3 years afraid that keeping her promise to a dying man would turn out to have been for nothing. Julian called the board back into the same room a few weeks later, the same table, the same chairs, several of the same people who had laughed the last time someone stood at that end of it with a notebook nobody wanted to read. This time, he was the one holding it. He didn't sit. He stood exactly where Renata had stood, and he told them, without softening a single part of it, that the company had known about a fatal design flaw 16 years ago, that an engineer named Michael Cole had warned them twice, and that the same company had gone on to service the vehicle that killed his wife and his son. He watched the room go as quiet as it had been loud the last time. Nobody laughed. He told them the notebook they'd once been asked to laugh at was going into full production across every vehicle in the fleet, effective immediately, and that every safety bulletin explaining why would carry Michael Cole's name on it, not the company's. One board member, one of the same people who had laughed the loudest the last time, started to raise a liability concern, and Julian cut him off before he finished the sentence, telling him plainly that he'd rather lose money telling the truth than keep making it by staying quiet, because staying quiet was the only thing that had ever truly cost him something that mattered. Granto say, sitting in the same seat he'd sat in the last time, watched Julian say it, and understood he was finally looking at the version of his old boss he'd almost stopped believing still existed. Julian adopted Michael's design across every vehicle in his fleet within the month, and he made sure Michael Cole's name, not his own company's, was the one attached to every safety bulletin that went out explaining why. He funded Renata's business fully, not as charity, but as a partnership, with her name on the contract this time, and no boardroom laughed. At the ceremony where the new safety standard was formally announced, Julian stood at the podium and told the story of a man he never met, who tried to save a family he never knew, and a woman he had once dismissed without ever asking her name. Renata didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply held Michael's notebook, finally opened, finally read, finally believed. If this story moved you even a little, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.